In this tutorial, we will learn about arrays in C. Normally, you use a variable to store a single value, but what if you want to store multiple values in one variable? This is where arrays come in handy. Let's take a look at an example where you have several integer variables representing a student's test scores, as shown here. So we have 4 separate variables, and each have their own values. Now, imagine if you had 100 test scores to manage. Creating 100 separate variables is not practical. Instead, you can use an array to simplify things. Arrays allow you to store multiple values in a single variable, and they can be of any data type. Here's how you would declare an array of integers to store the same 4 test scores. So we enter the data type, int, test scores. Now we include the square brackets. This is the syntax to declare an array. And we're also going to initialize this array by the same values that we see from lines 4 to line 7. So this is the syntax, the curly braces. In between the curly braces is where we can add the values. So let's start with test score 1, 100. Add a comma to separate the other values. 90, comma, 40, comma, 76. And don't forget your semicolon at the end of this line. This array is equivalent to these 4 variables. Each value in an array is called an element, and you have access to each element by index. In C, arrays use zero-based indexing, meaning the first element is at index 0. So that means that 100 is at index 0. This is at index 1, and so on. Let's delete these variables since we don't need them anymore. To access an element from this array, we can do so by entering test scores. And let's say that we want to use the first element, then we type in 0. Remember that C is using zero-based indexing for arrays, so 0 is the first element of this array. So let's print this out to actually see this value by using the printf. And I'm just going to print out the number. And let me complete the syntax. Now let's build and run this code. 100. And if I want to access the second element, then I do so by entering 1. And this will print out 90 instead of 100. 90. If I want to access the third element, then I enter 2, and as so. And if I want to access the fourth element, then I enter 3 as expected. You can also modify an element from this array by doing something like this. Test scores, and let's modify the last element. Let's replace the 76 with 80. And then if I want to print it again, then it will show 80. The program will output 76 and then will output 80 because on line 8, I modified this element and then I read the same position in the array again, then it will show a different value. Let me demonstrate this. 76 and 80 as expected. You can also declare an array without initializing in the beginning. So you can do something like this. You have to specify how many elements that need to be reserved for this array. We can say that we want to reserve 4 elements in the array. And eventually we assign new values by doing something like we did on line 8. We must be careful reading the array before assigning a value to them because the behavior can be unpredictable. Now let's clean this code up for the next example by using the previous array. To work efficiently with arrays, you can use loops. For example, let's use a for loop to print all the test scores from this array. So type in for int I equals 0 I is less than 4, I plus plus, want to increment, and then the curly braces. So this I here represents an index of an array, and we want to start from 0. This I will be used in between this square bracket, and I will demonstrate that momentarily. The conditional statement is saying that we want to run from 0 to 3. And then for each iteration of this for loop, we want to increment this index by 1. Since we're printing out every element of this array, we want to make it easier to display this information. And to make it easier, we can print out the text that can say test score 0 is equal to 100, test score 1 is equal to 90, and so on. So let me show you how to do that. So print f, double quotes. We can say test score %d, then include this equal sign, and then type in the other %d, and then let's do a new line and a comma. So this first %d is mapped to the first variable that I will pass to this printf function. Remember that we want to say that we want to display test score 0 is equal to 100. And the next one can say test score 1 is equal to 90. So we can use the I variable to display that. So the I is the index of this array. Since it starts at 0, it says test score 0. And then for the equal part, then that's where I can pass in the element from this array by typing in test scores, square bracket, and then I. This for loop calls this printf function 4 times. And then the index changes which element that we're accessing. Remember I said that it starts from 0 and then ends at 3. So for every iteration, it'll print out different values. And let me demonstrate that. As shown. One thing that we must be careful here is the conditional statement for this for loop. Let's say that instead of typing in 4, we type in 5. This will produce a runtime error because we only have 4 elements, not 5. So if we try to access to an element that's outside or out of bounds of this array, then the behavior is unpredictable. Let's say that I is equal to 4. We don't have an element at index 4. So what happens? One thing is that the behavior can be unpredictable when it comes to trying to read from the test scores at index 4. If we try to read it, then it can return a garbage value. So let's build and run to see what happens. So at the last line, it says test score 4 is equal to this big number here. And it's a garbage value because we don't have an element at index 4. So we must be careful when it comes to setting this conditional statement. So let's prepare for the next example. So let's clear this. In this example, I want to use a for loop to modify every single element of this array. To do this, let's copy and paste this for loop. Let's have it be the first one, and this one, let's delete this. Let's use this array with this index I, and let's set it to 1. And then let's keep this for loop as is because we want to print out every single element from this array. Once this gets printed out, we won't see the original values because they are overridden by this for loop here. So the terminal should output test score 0 is equal to 1, test score 1 is equal to 1, and so on. So let's demonstrate that as expected. This concludes our introduction to arrays in C. With arrays, you can manage multiple values efficiently using a single variable and take advantage of loops to perform operations. Thanks for following along.